Hey guys, welcome back to A Different Atheist Reads, A History of God by Karen Armstrong. I'm Christy Winters, and in the last video I discussed section 2 and the God of Abraham, talked a little bit about doing a rant, but upon reflection I've decided that because the last video I did a lot of work with that timeline, and I don't know if you checked out the links, but I put in like a ton of links in the description box last time. I didn't have a whole lot more to say that about the biggest issue I want to talk about is the idea that, you know, sort of Abraham was a historical person, or Moses might have been an historical person. But I think instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to present the last section of chapter 1, which it would be 3 of 3 here. And then what I will do in the next video is kind of do a general overview critique of historicity, things like that. But I won't leave you without a complete critique of the last one. I want to mention problems that I have in her bibliography. And so let's move right on to that before we get into the next section. So in terms of Karen's book, I mentioned, I think in an earlier video, that I looked at her references and I was a bit concerned about the dating of some of the articles. And just by way of a little bit of a critique from the last video, I went ahead and looked at the notes in her book, in History of God. And from what I can see, in chapter 1 she has 36 total references for 50 pages. Of those 36, 17 of them are books or some kind of publication, and the other ones are biblical quotes, like, you know, a Genesis line being a footnote. Of those 15 real non-biblical sources, 7 books are on either Hinduism or Buddhism, which by my count leaves 8 non-biblical sources for all of it, everything she does in chapter 1. That just seemed a little thin on the ground to me. And the other thing I mentioned as a critique was my concern about how recent or not recent her scholarship was. And in chapter 1, the latest book, the most recent book in the entirety of chapter 1 is 1971. And I'll remind you the book was written in 1993, or published in 1993. So that to me is a little bit worrisome, and I wanted to check it more rigorously because I'd sort of thrown that out before. And I thought, well, before we get on with section 3, we'll get a little bit of a rant about, you know, you might want to look to see what the most recent publication was. When I go to look something up as an academic, I have a strategy. I first go to Google Scholar, and I will get the most recent article, and I will get maybe 2 or 3 of the most recent articles, and I'll read through them, and they'll cite, if there's a key book that you need to read, it'll be that key seminal text will be in that book, but you'll have all the most recent publications in that from that article. So it's a really easy way to catch up with all of the scholarship that you're interested in. 1971, that's a long time ago. Moving on to the book, the last section of chapter 1. What I think Karen is sort of on about in this last section is to compare the more friendly, face-to-face God of Abraham with the very distant and all-powerful, all-knowing God of, sort of scary God of Moses. She doesn't really tell you this, of course, and so I'm assuming this is her intention, and I'm going to take it as her intention, and to continue on with the concept of God and the attributes that make up particular concepts of God. At the end of the Moses section, well, there's a little bit about Elijah, but it's mostly about Moses. I'm going to go over the attributes of the God as presented in the 3rd section here, the God of Moses. And then I will skip Hinduism, Buddhism as promised, and I will move right into the Greeks and do a very short summary of Plato and Aristotle, although she mentions a few other names. Those are the ones that she spends most of the time on. And I will then compare the attributes of the Greek god to the attributes that we've seen thus far, and you will see quite a bit of a difference. Again, discussing the idea of mythology and myth-making, Karen writes that when the Israelites recounted the story of Exodus, they were not interested in historical accuracy as we would be today. Instead, they wanted to bring out the significance of the original event, whatever that might have been. And she goes on to write that some scholars suggest that the Exodus story is a mythical rendering of a successful peasants' revolt against Egypt and their allies. The reference for this is one source. That to me is a little bit suspicious, because she does say some modern scholars, but it's not even a co-authored piece. It's just this one dude writing in the early 1970s. So normally I don't mix this up, but because I guess I didn't have a critique video, I just find this a little bit suspicious, and I want to flag it up. So What she then does is talk about the way that this god, the god of war and the god that leads them out of Egypt, is also going to be transformed into a god of transcendence and compassion. But the seeds that were sort of sown in the storytelling, she writes, the bloody story of Exodus would continue to inspire dangerous conceptions of the divine and a vengeful theology. We shall see that during the 7th century BCE, the Deuteronomist author would use the old myth to illustrate the fearful theology of election, which has, at different times, played a fateful role in the history of all three faiths. And by that she means the monotheistic faiths. She cites Deuteronomy 26 and cites the passage about Yahweh heard our voice and saw our misery, our toil and our oppression, and Yahweh brought us out of Egypt with mighty hand and outstretched arm, with great terror and with signs and wonders. And she points to this as the beginning of the God who may have inspired this successful peasants' revolt. Is also inspired an ideal of social justice. And she's linking this passage to her notion of social justice. I'll leave you to decide how you feel about that. In the story of Moses, she reiterates the same theme that she brought up with Abraham, the idea that the God Yahweh insists repeatedly and at some length that he indeed is the God of Abraham, even though he had originally been called El Shaddai. And whatever the provenance, Karen writes, the events of the Exodus made Yahweh the definitive God of Israel, and that Moses was able to convince the Israelites that he really was the one and the same as El, the God beloved by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So this notion of retcons is, she brings it up a second time, first with Abraham pointing to Moses, and now back to Moses pointing back at Abraham. This God, although claiming to be the same as the God of Abraham, is quite different in his interactions with human beings, his demands, and the impact of his presence. He inspires terror and insists upon distance, and when Moses asks his name, he gives the enigma, I am that I am. And she talks a little bit about that. It's not that interesting, I mean, it's not that important to our story, but if you're interested in learning Karen's take on that, then you can check out pages about 30 to 31 is where that starts in her book. In terms of the idea of a covenant, Karen, I applaud her for this, points out that it doesn't make sense to have a covenant unless you have polytheism. Because God, if there's only one God and there are no other gods that exist, then you can only have a relationship with one God. But if you have a lot of competition, then you want to write, an exclusive kind of franchise deal with one group, then you do need some kind of legal document. And that's what the covenant is. Another aspect of this relationship of development of God Karen touches upon is when, in the story, the Israelites go back to Canaan and go back to the cult of Baal and Asherah. I know evidence in his A History of God video for Karen Armstrong mentions this very clearly and does a very good job of it. When you have a god of war, then what you have is, destruction and mayhem, and you don't have any stability. When the war is over, there are the two F's, food and the other F that goes with it, and that's what you do when when you're not at war. You want to make sure your food supply is safe, you're secure, and you're reproducing. And it doesn't make sense to worship a war god when what you want to do is be fruitful and multiply. It makes a lot more sense now to a reader if you understand that there were a lot of gods, there was competition, it was a free market system. Republicans would have loved early polytheism, right? You compete for the best gods. And you compete for the god, you worship the god that you need. And in the story, the logic of the people makes a lot of sense. They get out of Egypt, they had a war god on their side, pushing them, helping them out, again, the story. And then when everything is settled down and they're ready to kind of get their lives going again, they want to think about children and sustaining their food supply. And this story now makes a lot more sense if you understand the competing goods that various gods were delivering, and also that the god that becomes Yahweh wasn't an all-around god. He wasn't a fertility god and a war god and a peace god and a love god and a hate god. He had his own specialty as well, and he had priests who were advocating for him. And the pushing of this priest to exclude all gods except the war god made sense to them, but you can see where it wouldn't necessarily make sense to people who'd grown up in a polytheistic background. I want to touch just very briefly on Elijah, because Karen brings it up a little bit to, I think, ease the transition of this very brutal God of Moses to something a bit more personal. And in God's relationship to Elijah, there's some personal moments. And she talks in particular and raises the point about him having what she calls a theophany, I think is the right term. And I'm not entirely sure what is the difference between a theophany and an epiphany, and she doesn't really link them up or discuss that. But in terms of his experience, Elijah perceives God not as the pagans do within the earth or the moon or other natural phenomenon, but rather as the silence of a stilled voice or something along those lines. So it's a very sort of interesting new conceptualization of God that is moving away from paganism into a new form. It's just a kernel of an idea at this point. So we have, I guess what she wants to point to are these little seeds that other later authors will draw upon and expand. She doesn't do a good job in the text of that, so that's why I'm doing it. Okay, attributes break. Before we move into the Greeks, let's do a review of the characteristics we've seen in the God of Moses according to Karen Armstrong. So from what I can see in the text, what I would say about this God, the God of Moses as presented in section 3, is that he's temporal. He comes in for a few days and hangs out in a mountain, and then he goes away again, apparently. He is still limited in his power. He's given the 10 Commandments, on stone to Moses and doesn't even realize there's a golden calf being built behind his back. He's getting closer to omniscience, but he's certainly, in that way, not completely omniscient. He's making big claims and doing magical things and having all of this knowledge and this power, but he does still seem to be limited. He's still geographical and spatial. He's hanging out on a mountain, with people, and then he comes to the mountain, he leaves it. He still changes his mind and his character over time, and he exists in a polytheistic world. And I would say that there still exists a personal relationship with this God, but it's transformed from a face-to-face kind of personal relationship to this covenant of more of an agreement rather than a more interpersonal expectation of what is to be expected of God. We see notions of holiness and divine presence and human beings now having to react to the divineness of this particular God. He is righteous in that he has moral demands that he places on his followers and expectations of their moral conduct. And I would say he's pretty unjust. He's not the epitome of justice. His treatment of the Egyptians and the killing of firstborn children is very, very unjust. And so we don't yet see this notion of God, worshiping God because you like him or because he's nice or he's good. Kind of worship him because you're scared of him, and you want him on your side rather than not on your side, is more of the feeling I get. In terms of his morals, he's morally questionable. He's not all good in any kind of meaningful way. He's, as I mentioned, merciless. And instead of love, I think we initially talked about love versus hate or contempt or apathy. It does seem to be more loyalty, alliance, rather than what we would call like affection. And so just go with that. The last thing is that this is a God of external, not internal inspiration. He is going to show up and give you stuff. He's going to show up and be the small, still voice or whatever. He is not going to be inside you. You're not going to be filled up with the Spirit. It's definitely a division between the presence, this God and human beings. Karen contrasts this God of passion and destruction and demands and nice things too, I'm sure, but generally this God of Moses isn't so great, to the Greeks who were interested in logic and in reason. And in this, she focuses primarily on Plato and Aristotle, and I will say at this point that I am vaguely familiar with the Greek philosophers and their ideas, but I am not a philosopher. I've never done philosophy courses. I've dated philosophers, and that's about like the closest I've come to, like having regular exposure to philosophical ideas, but I've not really done it systematically. So if you are an expert on any of these topics and Karen is getting stuff wrong, please let me know in the comments. And then I will give you a shout out, and I will bring up your points and put up whatever information you want to bring to other people's attention to correct and refine, get a more accurate depiction. So please go ahead and do that. I love the comments you guys have been putting up underneath the videos, and I can tell you're really engaging with this, and it means so much to me to know. So if I could rely a little bit on your expertise, it would let me relax a little bit too. So I look forward to, again, if you see anything that's out of order or hear anything that's out of order, please let me know, and I will certainly put it in the next video. Now, according to Armstrong, Plato also believed in the existence of a divine, unchanging reality beyond the world of the senses, that the soul was a fallen divinity out of its element, imprisoned in the body, but capable of regaining its divine status by the purification of the reasoning powers of the mind. If you need to correct that, please do. But otherwise, I'm just going to kind of move on. She also, I should say before you start, if you're starting to get very excited, she does write, later in his life, Plato may have retreated from his doctrine of the eternal forms or ideas, but they became crucial to many monotheists when they tried to express their conception of God. These ideas were stable, consistent realities which could be apprehended through the reasoning powers of the mind. So that's where she kind of how she sets up Plato. She also notes that Plato was convinced that the divine world was static and changeless, and that the Greeks generally saw movement and change as signs of inferior reality. Something that had true identity, according to Armstrong, remained always the same, characterized by permanence and immutability. This utterly static image of divinity would have an immense influence on Jews, Christians, and Muslims, even though it had little in common with the God of Revelation, who is constantly active, innovative, and in the Bible even changes his mind. So she's contrasting it here. I actually think she could have done it a little bit more and brought this out a bit more, but at least she is connecting up here these ideas and comparing them with what has gone earlier. What Karen then does is go on to explain her presentation of Aristotle's idea of emanation accounts. Now, because again, this isn't my specialty and I want to make sure that I get it correct, I'm going to read this rather than make it up or improv this part of it, because it'll just get really bad really quick. This God was pure being, and as such eternal, immobile, and spiritual. God was pure thought, at one and the same time thinker and thought, engaged in an eternal moment of contemplation of himself, the highest object of knowledge. In that matter is flawed and mortal, there can be no material element in God or the higher grades of being. The unmoved mover causes all of the motion and activity in the universe, and since each movement must have a cause, it can be traced back to the single source. Now, we know modern reasons why that's not a very good form of reasoning, but we're not going to deal with that right now. And this is the presentation that she gives of Aristotle's God and clarifying his notion of it. And she then kind of closes up a little bit by saying, despite the important position of the unmoved mover in Aristotle's system, his God had little religious relevance. Because that God had not created the world, he really was not involved in the change in the reality of it. That is then sort of the end of that chapter, and she goes into the next one. But before we finish, I want to go over the attributes of the Greek God, or the Greek notions of the divine. And unlike what we saw with the God of Moses, it is eternal, it is omnipotent, it is the source of every motion and everything following on. It presumably has omniscience because it is being, and it has omnipresence, again, I would imagine because of its knock-on effects. Again, if you guys want to correct some of this in terms of the unmoved mover, I will gladly accept corrections. I'm not above being corrected when I'm wrong, and I won't take offense. I welcome being corrected when I'm wrong, because I don't want to be wrong. The other characteristics are immutability and transcendence. Again, if we put this up against either the God of Abraham or Moses, we're seeing very, very, very foreign ideas to anything that has existed from that time period of when the Babylonian writings came up, even until the notions of Elijah. It was Elijah first. But we don't see notions of morality in the unmoved mover, emotions, and we don't see a source of inspiration. So although it's reasoned out beautifully and it has an aesthetic, this notion of the Greek notion of the divine, it is quite distant, and it doesn't have that kind of relevance, whereas you do have the God of Moses and Abraham interfering with lives and acting in a very personal way to determine the course of human events. Zoom, we are done with chapter 1. Okay, maybe not Zoom. This is probably like 2.5 hours worth of talk or something, but we are to the end of chapter 1, and we still have one more rant to go, so you guys can look forward to that next week, Thursday. And I will also, all right, you guys stay to the end of the video, so you get to hear a little secret. It's not really a secret, it's just a surprise, I guess. I, this week, cleared 200 subscribers, and so to thank you guys for your subscriptions and for your time and your comments and everything else that you give in response to my content, I am going to do a special 200 subscriber bonus video. I'm planning on putting it out in the next couple days, and in that bonus video, what I decided to present is I'm going to tell my deconversion story. But I can't just sit in front of a camera and talk and tell a conversion story, partly because I don't know that you would find that particularly interesting. It's not my kind of content. It's not what I do. But I realized even when I was doing the slides for the deconversion video, the planning of it, I can't just tell my story anymore, because I've watched enough people's deconversion, stories, and I've done enough thinking about it that now when I was writing out my story, I'm like, oh, here I am in this phase, and here I am in that phase, and this phase lasted this long, and here was the major problem that I had that created a paradigm shift. So I can't just tell you my deconversion story anymore, because I'm too academic-y about it. But what I can do is use my deconversion story as a case study and use it to illustrate some of the concepts that I've identified in the data. Natural skeptics versus natural believers, for instance, in which category I fell into, natural believer. And the time periods and some of the common experience that I see atheists going through, I can show through my little deconversion story. So that's the current plan. I'll be filming that in the next couple days and putting it out. And it really is to say thank you for every one of you who subscribed. It does really make a difference to me. I was tired. I came home from work tonight. I didn't want to make this video, but I knew that people were enjoying it and looking forward to my Thursday videos. So you really do inspire me. You are the reasons I'm sitting in front of this computer right now when I just want to be chilling out on my couch. So thank you for the inspiration. Thank you for subscribing and pushing me to do this. By showing me that you care, it makes me care about putting out really great content so that I live up to what I've given you guys before. So look forward to the bonus video. It's as a thank you, and thank you for hanging out all the way to the end of the video. And I guess the only thing left to be said is that this has been A Different Atheist Reads. I've been Christy, you've been awesome, and thanks for watching. See you next Thursday.